You were never supposed to hear this. There are stories buried so deep in America's soil that even the whispers of their truth can make a man's soul tremble. Stories wrapped in the flesh of respectability and nailed shut in coffins of silence. But once you pry open the lid, what lies inside does not sleep. In 1823, beneath the quiet hills of Pennsylvania, in the tiny town of Millbrook, a respected family ran a funeral home. For 22 years they comforted grieving mothers, buried. The fathers of small farms whispered prayers over the bodies of children. They smiled, they served, and they killed. This isn't folklore. This isn't ghost tale. This is what happens when death becomes a business and murder becomes an art. Millbrook was not special. And that's what made it the perfect hunting ground. 300 souls scattered across farmlands, isolated from the cities, bonded by trust. You grow up in a place like that. You don't question the ones who feed you, who bless your dead, who stand beside you when the ground swallows someone you loved. You certainly don't suspect the undertaker or his daughter or the woman who brought your dying mother that final bowl of soup. And so the Hartwells thrived. Ezekiel Hartwell, the patriarch, brought his family north with gold in his pockets and secrets in his blood. He didn't just bury the dead. He studied them. He preserved them. He arranged them like furniture and learned how they broke. His wife, Martha, sweet-faced and scripture-quoting, became the perfect front. A woman trusted by the sick, loved by the poor. And their children were raised in darkness. By 1823, 17 unexplained deaths had occurred in just 3 months. 17. All processed through the same stone house at the edge of Millbrook. All embalmed, dressed, and buried by the Hartwells. At first glance, the numbers were only unusual, not alarming. Until Dr. Samuel Harrison, a state physician, arrived. Sent for a routine inspection, he was supposed to pass through in a day. Check for cholera signs, look over water supplies, and leave with a warm pie and a wave from the good people of Millbrook. Instead, he found bruises hidden under collars, puncture wounds carefully placed, arsenic residue around mouths that should have spoken longer. The bodies didn't whisper. They screamed. The Hartwells greeted him with warmth. But warmth can be a mask. Ezekiel was smooth, proud of his tools, the cleanliness of his rooms, the respectability of his house. Josiah, the eldest son, showed him the bodies, never making full eye contact. And Martha? She prepared tea that was never poured, and stood in the doorway like a sentinel, her smile rigid and wrong. As Dr. Harrison leaned over the body of Eleanor Fairchild, a widow supposedly dead from consumption, he noticed bruises along the throat. She hadn't wasted away. She'd been strangled. Josiah called it post-mortem bruising, a consequence of embalming. But Harrison had seen corpses before. The blood knew. Next was Marcus Webb, a farmer, 42 years old. Fit, found dead in the fields from a heart attack. But his body bore small, deliberate punctures. Not the clumsy result of a fall. No, this was surgical, precise. Harrison's concern mounted. Then came Mary Patterson, 26, mother, poisoned, white residue around her lips and beneath her fingernails. Arsenic, used to kill rats. Now used, it seemed, to silence mothers. The family grew tense. Eyes met behind the doctor's back. Caleb, the younger son, subtly positioned himself between Harrison and the lower shelves in the basement. A journal lay half-hidden beneath burial shrouds, its cover cracked, its pages filled with ink and calculation. Harrison saw enough to recognize names of townspeople, notes about their habits, even their finances. But Caleb's body moved like a door slamming shut. It was family business, he said. Dr. Harrison did not sleep that night. At the Millbrook Inn. He wrote notes, drew sketches, cataloged wounds. But it was the townsfolk who delivered the final confirmations. They came to him in whispers. Women. Mostly, Husbands, mothers, sons gone. And always just before they slipped into death, the Hartwells were there, with soup, with comfort, with hands so warm you never noticed the cold creeping in behind them. One woman, Sarah Petton, told him her mother had been healthy, just a bit of arthritis. Then Martha came, day after day, feeding her kindness and something else. 3 days later, she was dead. The Hartwells refused payment, of course. Said it was charity. The story doesn't begin in 1823. That's only when the mask started to slip. The Hartwells arrived in Millbrook in 1801. They said they'd come from Western Virginia, that Ezekiel had learned the burial trade from an uncle in Richmond, but no one ever saw records. No one ever met the uncle. What people did see, though, was gold. A lot of it. They purchased their home in full from the estate of a landowner who died unexpectedly. Locals chalked it up to luck, or God's favor. That first winter, a sickness swept through the town. 8 dead. All buried by the Hartwells. There were murmurs, sure. People wondered how fast the Hartwells could respond, how quickly they secured the dead. How odd it was that delays were discouraged. But who would question the family who offered help when your father lay stiff in a cold bed? Who would suspect the girl who wept with you over your sister's casket? And so, the years passed. The death toll rose, but suspicion never stuck. The Hartwells were careful. They studied their community. They mapped out the town not in roads, but in weaknesses. They knew who was alone, who was sick, who had money hidden under floorboards and no one to claim it. They learned which poisons left no trace, which injuries could be blamed on bad luck, which faces people cried over and which ones they quietly forgot. Down in the basement, behind a false wall that even Dr. Harrison missed, the Hartwells kept a second lab. A place of tools not used for preparation but experimentation. Surgical knives, anatomical sketches, vials labeled in Latin, and organs, preserved, sorted, some still warm when bottled. The journal when later found in full documented not just who died, but how they died, how long they took, what they said before death, how their eyes changed, and which methods left the least suspicion. It was not murder for need. It was murder as study, murder as control. Are you still listening? If you've come this far, you're not like the rest. You don't look away when the veil lifts. You don't flinch when the pretty mask falls from respectable faces. So write this in the comments to lock it in and let the others know you're awake now. The dead never rest when the living lie. Write it twice. The dead never rest when the living lie. Let it echo. And know this: what the Hartwells did wasn't isolated. It was a mirror, reflecting what happens when power hides behind kindness, when institutions turn into machinery, when the very people trusted to care for our dead become obsessed with the silence that follows death, and we've only just begun to open the door. They say evil announces itself with screams, but that's a lie made for children. Real evil wears a quiet face. It dresses in Sunday clothes and offers you a warm hand when your world is collapsing. It moves through communities not like a monster, but like a helper. The Hartwells understood that principle to perfection. They didn't hide in shadows. They walked in the light of town squares and prayer meetings, smiled with the sincerity of saints, and buried their secrets 6 feet under. But the bones always remember. And when enough bodies lie beneath a single house, even the soil begins to whisper. Dr. Harrison sat alone that night in his rented room above the Millbrook Inn. His notes spread before him like a battlefield. The bruises, the punctures, the powder, each a wound not just on the victims, but on the illusion of community trust. His hands trembled not from fear, but from recognition. He had seen outbreaks before: disease, pestilence, fevers that swept through towns like wildfires. But this was different. This was deliberate, controlled, crafted. the methodical precision behind the deaths told a story that went beyond madness. This was design, a pattern. And patterns never stop on their own. They accelerate. Thomas Creed knocked on his door just before midnight. Martha Hartwell's elderly father, eyes sunken with age and something deeper, something haunted. He asked for a private consultation, claiming sharp pains in his stomach. But the moment the door closed behind them, the frailty vanished. His voice dropped. His face changed. It wasn't the face of a man in pain. It was the face of a man carrying a truth too heavy for one soul. What he told Dr. Harrison over the next hour shattered whatever hope remained that this was a case of isolated murder. No, this was something older, deeper, practiced over decades. Creed had been part of it once, not a killer, an observer. At first, he said, it began with robbing the graves of strangers. In 1801, shortly after the family arrived in Millbrook, Ezekiel needed money. The dead offered easy targets, no witnesses, no outcry. Bodies exhumed under the cover of night, jewelry taken, coins pried from the mouths of the poor. The graves were shallow. The law was thin. It was practical, not personal. But then something changed. They stopped waiting for the bodies. They started making them. The transition from grave robbers to murderers wasn't abrupt. It was slow, calculated. The family studied poisons. They tested dosages on animals. They watched how long it took for different illnesses to mimic natural death. Then, they began applying what they learned. Creed was there when the first test was done. A man named Jonas Ellerby, a loner mid-50s, suffering from a chronic cough. Martha had visited him often, bringing him warm broth, herbal tea. Creed noticed the shift in Jonas's behavior, how he grew confused, weak, how he began hallucinating. By the fourth day, he was dead. No one questioned it. Old age, they said. The cough finally got him, but Creed knew. He'd seen the tea leaves laced with crushed root. He'd seen Martha's eyes after Jonas passed cold, calculating, not mourning, but studying. Creed tried to leave the family then. He tried to confront his daughter, begged her to stop, warned her about God, about judgment. But she laughed, said God had already turned his face away from Millbrook, said that death wasn't something to be feared, it was something to be mastered. And that's what they were doing, mastering it. Ezekiel had become obsessed, not just with embalming, but with anatomy, preservation, and control. He wanted to understand the moment between life and death. He wanted to own it, to slow it down, to dissect it like a butterfly pinned under glass. The children were brought in early. Josiah, the eldest, was taught to handle the bodies, to carve them gently, precisely. Caleb was stronger, rougher. He became the enforcer, the one who held them down when subtlety failed. Rebecca, sweet-faced and soft-spoken, was trained as the lure. Creed said she had a gift. People trusted her instantly. She'd sit beside the dying, hold their hands, listen to their regrets. And when the time came, she'd whisper something to them, something no one else could hear. Then they'd close their eyes and never open them again. The family became surgical in their operations. Not every death was a murder, many truly were natural. But among the honest dead, they scattered their work like poison in a feast. Never 2 in the same week, never in families with political pull. They focused on the isolated, the forgotten, the burdened. Creed said they kept a list, a literal one. In the journal Dr. Harrison had glimpsed, each name was marked with symbols. Some indicated ease of access. Others, the presence of valuables in the home. Others still marked experimental potential diseases to study, organs to preserve. It was a ledger of death. Dr. Harrison listened, torn between horror and professional detachment. He knew he had enough evidence now, testimony from a family insider, 3 bodies with inconsistent causes of death, and growing suspicion among townspeople. But evidence wasn't enough. Not here, not in a place where people love the Hartwells. He needed proof, visual, tangible. He needed the journal. And to get it, he would need to return to the house. At dawn, Dr. Harrison made his move. He approached the local sheriff, a man named Walter Greaves, skeptical, slow-speaking, and deeply loyal to his town. Harrison laid out what he knew. The sheriff frowned. Sighed he'd known the Hartwells for 20 years. Said they'd buried his mother. Said they'd held his daughter's hand when she died in childbirth. But something in Harrison's eyes unsettled him. So he agreed, quietly, a visit, unannounced. They went together. Knocked at the door of the funeral home just past sunrise. Martha answered, her expression a perfect blend of concern and hospitality. She welcomed them in, offered tea. Josiah stood by the fireplace, his hands folded, polite. Caleb sat sharpening a small knife near the window, a motion that seemed both innocent and menacing. The doctor requested a second look at the preparation area, said he needed to verify some notes for his report. Martha hesitated, but the presence of the sheriff forced her hand. In the basement, the air was colder than before. The jars still lined the shelves. The walls still bore the stains of secrets too old to wash out. But this time, Harrison pressed. Further, he opened cabinets, pulled aside curtains, and behind a hanging tapestry he found it. A thin seam in the stone wall, barely visible. Caleb moved, fast, but the sheriff stepped between them. A moment of silence passed. Then Martha's voice, soft and flat, broke the stillness. "You don't want to see what's behind there," she said. "Some knowledge cannot be returned." But Harrison stepped forward anyway, pried the false wall open. And behind it, he saw the truth. The real laboratory. Steel tools that glinted in the half-light. Preserved remains, sketches, not for education, but for experimentation. And in the center of the room, on a table draped in oilcloth, the journal. Large, leather-bound, heavy. He opened it. Inside, names, hundreds, dates, diagrams, measurements, comments like, "Too quick, try lower dosage next time," or resisted vocal. Chords severed post-mortem. Each page turned like a blade through the heart of the community. The sheriff looked on, pale, silent. His hand trembled as it reached for his sidearm. "My mother's name is in here," he whispered. Page 12. They arrested the Hartwells that afternoon. Ezekiel, Josiah, Martha, and Caleb. Rebecca was not found. She had vanished before dawn, leaving behind only a torn page from the journal. And a note that read, "Not all of us were ready to stop." The townspeople reacted with disbelief, then rage, then grief. Graves were exhumed, bodies re-examined. More signs of tampering. More bruises. More lies. The trial would come later. But the truth had already been unearthed. A truth so disturbing that newspapers refused to print the full details. A truth buried again by officials who feared what it might do to the public psyche. But not everyone forgot. Some remembered. And some recorded. Like Dr. Harrison. Like Thomas Creed, who died shortly after the arrests. Like the sheriff, who would never again speak in public. And now you've heard it. Are you starting to see how deep this goes? Are you ready to fall further? Say it again, for those who still think this is just a story. The dead never rest when the living lie. Write it below, twice, like carving it in stone, because what happened in Millbrook wasn't unique. It was a crack in the mask of decency, a glimpse into what happens when power answers to no one, and the Hartwells weren't the first. They won't be the last. And if you think it ended there, wait until you hear what was found beneath the cemetery behind the house. They say history is written by the victors, but there are stories so dark, so drenched in suppressed screams and blood-soaked shadows, that no empire dares inscribe them. These are not tales carved into monuments or echoed in national anthems. These are whispered warnings hidden between the cracks of ruins and beneath the dust of forgotten crypts. Section 3 takes us further into this suffocating abyss, a descent not into myth, but into the machinery of mental chains. Not iron or rope, but invisible prison bars constructed through language, ritual, and repetition. The most effective slavery is the kind where the enslaved believe they are free. And so we arrive at the grand design of psychological control, far more dangerous than whips and walls. This was the era where kings became gods, where symbols replaced logic, and where obedience was no longer forced, it was felt. Deep in the hearts of men who were born beneath thrones and taught to bow before they could stand. It begins with a crown not of gold, but of perception. The ancient world was ruled by monarchs who claimed divine bloodlines, not through evidence or wisdom, but through fear perpetuated across generations. In Sumer, in Egypt, in China, and in Mesoamerica, rulers declared themselves as the sun incarnate, sons of heaven, avatars of gods. It wasn't enough to hold a sword, they held the keys to the afterlife. Imagine being told from birth that questioning your ruler wasn't just treason, it was sacrilege. The penalty wasn't death, it was eternal damnation. What better system of control than one that enslaved not just your body, but your soul? And so societies knelt, not out of cowardice, but out of inheritance. They were born into myth, trained into obedience, and baptized in fear. This illusion wasn't confined to temples and pyramids. It was baked into language, twisted into laws, and embedded in the very rhythm of time. The 7-day week, the solar calendars, the eclipses tied to rituals, all mapped and measured to reinforce the idea that the cosmos itself obeyed the king. And if the stars bowed, so must you. When plague came, it was your disobedience. When drought arrived, it was your lack of offerings. The weather was punishment, the volcano was rage. Every natural event was no longer just nature, it was a message from above. Rulers didn't just rule, they interpreted the will of the sky. You weren't ruled by a man, you were ruled by heaven itself. And who would dare rebel against the divine? But even the divine needs messengers. Enter the priest class, those cloaked in ceremonial garb, muttering tongues no commoner understood, scribbling in sacred scripts guarded by gates and death. These weren't just religious figures. They were gatekeepers of truth. They held the scrolls. They decided what was holy, what was heresy, what would be remembered, and what would be erased. They told you which stars were lucky, what plants were sacred, and what thoughts were blasphemous. And just like that, the mind itself became colonized. You didn't just fear the sword, you feared your own imagination, because even thoughts could be policed. Even questions could kill. And this was not an accident. This was architecture. Every symbol carved into stone, every ritual recited under moonlight, every myth passed from mouth to mouth. They weren't just stories. They were weapons, psychological weapons. The Tower of Babel, the divine right of kings, the mandate of heaven. These weren't cultural quirks. They were sophisticated control mechanisms. They ensured that generation after generation would be born into a reality so carefully constructed, so masterfully woven, that even the idea of escape would feel like madness. You were not just a subject, you were part of a play written by people long dead. And your role had been assigned before your first breath. But what happens when someone tries to rewrite the script? Enter the heretics, the rebels, the visionaries branded as lunatics. History has buried them under curses and flames, but if you listen closely, you can still hear their screams echoing from burned libraries and blood-soaked altars. Hypatia of Alexandria, torn apart for teaching mathematics outside the church's control. Giordano Bruno, burned alive for daring to say the stars were suns. Countless shamans, midwives, thinkers, erased not because they were dangerous with weapons, but because they were dangerous with truth. Because the greatest threat to a lie is someone who simply asks, why? And so the system adapted. The more control slipped, the more sophisticated the tools became. Ancient rulers used gods. Medieval tyrants used churches. But the modern age, it uses science, politics, algorithms. Today, it's not a priest reading the stars. It's a corporation reading your clicks. You are still being profiled, predicted, nudged, not by gods but by data. The same architecture with a new disguise. Today, instead of altars, we kneel at glowing screens. Instead of offerings, we pay with attention. Instead of priests, we have influencers, pundits, and machines learning your patterns better than you know yourself. The chains are invisible, but the pull is just as strong. Consider this. What if the greatest illusion of all is the illusion of freedom? You're told you can choose, but the choices are curated. You're told you can speak, but your words are drowned in noise. You're told you can know, but the truth is buried beneath floods of distraction. Bread and circuses, once the domain of emperors, now updated as binge streams and breaking news. You're too entertained to revolt, too tired to think, too medicated to feel, and that's the point. The system doesn't want you angry, it wants you numb. Because numb minds don't ask dangerous questions. And yet, there's always been a crack. A whisper, a glimmer. The human spirit, somehow, always finds a way to peer through the veil. It may take centuries. It may come at the cost of lives, sanity, or safety. But the urge to remember, to awaken, to defy it, never fully dies. That's why every empire must burn its books. That's why every tyrant must erase its past. Because in every forbidden text, in every forgotten language, in every ancient symbol, there lies a map. A map out of the maze. A way to rewire the mind and reclaim the soul. So the real question isn't whether you're free. The question is, what stories are you still trapped inside? What myths do you unconsciously obey? Whose voice lives in your head when you decide what is right or wrong? And most importantly, who benefits from that voice? You see, the most effective control is not external. It's internalized. It's when the cage becomes comfortable. When the chains become identity. When your prison becomes your pride. This is the dark genius of psychological control. It doesn't just shape nations. It shapes minds. It doesn't conquer land, it conquers perception. And once perception is owned, reality itself is nothing more than a script written by someone else, acted out by you, applauded by those still asleep. But you're not asleep, are you? You felt it, the unease, the glitch, the sense that something is off, even if you can't name it, that quiet rebellion in your chest, that whisper behind the noise, that feeling that truth is not what you were taught, that sense that maybe, just maybe, everything you've ever known was designed not to enlighten, but to enslave. That is the ember, the crack in the mask, the beginning of your own awakening. But remember, those who wake up are often punished. History is full of those who saw too much, asked too much, broke too many illusions. Their names were erased. Their faces forgotten. But their warnings remain if you're willing to listen. And now you've heard them. So what will you do with that knowledge? Because once the veil is lifted, it can't be unlifted. Once you see the bars, you can't unsee them. Once you know the script, you have two choices: act it, or rewrite it. Write it. In the cold corridors of history, there are stories so deeply buried that their faint echoes seem to tremble the bones of the present. Section 4 of this descent takes us deeper into the guts of forgotten experiments, sinister alliances, and the calculated architecture of human behavior control that was never meant to surface. We begin in the ashes of war, where peace is just a word used to keep populations docile, while those in power rearm in silence. After World War II, as the world celebrated victory, the real war, the psychological one, was only beginning. With the fall of Nazi Germany came not just the end of a regime, but the opening of a vault. A vault filled with secrets, research, and scientists willing to trade morality for sanctuary. Operation Paperclip, once dismissed as conspiracy, is now a historical certainty. Over 1,600 former Nazi scientists were quietly brought to the United States. Their crimes erased, their expertise welcomed. Men who had experimented on human beings, who had mapped the limits of pain, obedience, and fear, not to be punished, but to be hired, to build rockets, to explore space, and more quietly to build new tools of control. While the public eye followed the space race, in the shadows, the race was for the mind. The CIA, disturbed by the idea that the Soviets were perfecting brainwashing, launched a secret program so dark it remained hidden for decades. MK-Ultra. The name alone carries the weight of dread, a modern incantation of scientific malevolence. What started as an intelligence operation morphed into a labyrinth of torture, memory erasure, and psychological reprogramming. Citizens, soldiers, prisoners, and the mentally ill became subjects in a sprawling, untraceable web of human testing. They were slipped LSD without their knowledge, locked in isolation chambers, exposed to repeated hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and emotional dismantling. The goal wasn't just to see what broke people, it was to find out how to rebuild them into something more useful, something programmable. It was about learning the language of the mind well enough to rewrite it. One of the most disturbing truths to emerge from MK-Ultra is that it wasn't limited to hidden bunkers and black sites. Some of the most respected institutions in America were co-conspirators. Harvard, Stanford, McGill, medical, research facilities and universities received quiet funding and instructions, often with plausible deniability. Doctors you might trust with your life were testing chemical mind control on unwitting patients. In one case, a Canadian psychiatric hospital, led by Dr. Ewan Cameron, received CIA funding to subject patients to psychic driving, a method involving prolonged drug-induced comas, repeated messages played over loudspeakers, and electroshock far beyond therapeutic levels. The result? Minds shattered. Identities erased. Victims who could no longer remember their children, their names, or why they were ever admitted. But the psychological war wasn't confined to labs and institutions. It seeped into culture, into media, into our homes. The rise of television, often hailed as a miracle of modern connection, was simultaneously a tool of subtle manipulation. Not in the crude, subliminal messages kind of way, but in how narratives were shaped. Heroes and villains were chosen not just for entertainment, but for ideological alignment. News anchors became oracles of national emotion. Stories that promoted certain values, obedience, fear of the outsider, blind patriotism, were fed in endless loops. And those that questioned the narrative? Marginalized, mocked, or disappeared. Social engineering at this scale requires not just participation, but belief. And belief requires emotion. Enter trauma. A population in fear is a population easily led. The 20th century became a carousel of manufactured crises, some real, some inflated, to keep societies in a low simmer of panic. Each new war, terror, threat, economic collapse, or epidemic had the double function of consolidating control. With each emergency, citizens gave away a little more freedom, for safety, for order, for normalcy. But the old normal never returned. Each time, the leash shortened. Each time, the watchers got better at watching. In the late 1960s and early 70s, the counterculture threatened to derail this trajectory. People were waking up, protesting wars, questioning authority, exploring consciousness on their own terms. The establishment responded not with force alone, but with infiltration. Documents later revealed that organizations like the FBI's COINTELPRO actively worked to discredit, disrupt and neutralize civil rights groups, peace movements, and spiritual leaders. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. were harassed, threatened, and surveilled. The Black Panthers, painted as terrorists, were often subject to orchestrated violence. Even the realm of psychedelics, once promising a new frontier of human understanding, was tainted. LSD, originally part of MK Ultra, was leaked into the counterculture with dual intent. Enlightenment, yes, but also chaos, confusion, and the undermining of credibility. Fast forward to the digital age. The battleground has evolved, but the war remains the same. Now the tools are not just chemicals or television now, they are algorithms. Data is the new mind map. Every click, scroll, and pause is a breadcrumb leading to your psychological profile. And what once required covert agents and secret funding is now handled by artificial intelligence. Surveillance has become so normalized we carry it in our pockets willingly. We volunteer our thoughts, preferences, and desires to platforms designed not to connect us, but to shape us, to divide, to enrage, to direct behavior. Social media is not just a mirror of society, it is a magnifier of its most volatile elements. The outrage machine is no accident, it's design. The more reactive we are, the more profitable we become. And the more divided we are, the easier to manage. Political polarization, racial tension, economic panic, all hypercharged through curated feeds that show us not what is real, but what is effective. We are no longer just viewers, we are participants in our own programming. The screen has become a two-way mirror, and beneath it all, the same institutions remain: intelligence agencies, military contractors, think tanks funded by unseen interests. They don't need to hide anymore, because now the truth is too unbelievable, too complex, too exhausting to untangle. This is the brilliance of the modern control system. It doesn't just imprison the body or censor the voice. It erodes the will to know. We mock what we fear. We fear what we can't understand. And so we scroll, we consume. We forget, occasionally. Whistleblowers surface. Names like Snowden, Assange, and Manning flash across headlines. They are called traitors or heroes, depending on who owns the narrative. They reveal glimpses in SO wiretaps, diplomatic manipulations, drone strikes, and black sites. But the reaction is fleeting. A moment of outrage, then silence. Because the system counts on our exhaustion, on the fact that we must go to work, feed our families, try to live. The machine doesn't need to kill the rebel, it only needs to outlast him. There are those who still resist. Independent journalists, hacktivists, quiet researchers digging through declassified archives. Survivors of experiments who refuse to stay silent. But they are fractured, scattered, dismissed as conspiracy theorists. And when they get too close, the cost is often their freedom, or their sanity, or their lives. In this age, truth is not censored, it is drowned in noise, in entertainment, in infinite distractions. Yet something stirs beneath the surface. A quiet reawakening. A sense that the veil is thinning, that too many coincidences, too many patterns are no longer ignorable. People are asking again, questioning, not just what happened, but who benefits. Not just what is shown, but what is hidden. It is dangerous to peer into the abyss, but perhaps necessary. For only by seeing the machine can we refuse to be its gears. The question is no longer whether the system is real. The question is, what are you willing to do with that knowledge? And more hauntingly, how much of your mind is still your own? Your own. A whisper echoed in the corners of Europe during the late 1500s. A whisper so terrifying that no priest, no monarch, no scholar dared to utter it aloud. But it spread like disease, like fire through the backrooms of abbeys, the torture chambers of castles, and the corrupted pages of forbidden texts. It was the rumor that the rulers of men no longer ruled alone. that they were answering to something older, something cloaked not in flesh but in ritual, shadow, and an understanding of human obedience so deep it could rewire the soul. At the heart of this whisper stood the Council of the Nine, not kings, not cardinals, something else. Something that moved behind thrones, puppeteered through dreams, and fed not on gold or power, but on submission, on belief, and on the very mechanisms of control themselves. And their favorite tool was not the sword, it was the symbol. For what the sword conquered, the symbol kept. The cross, the crown, the eye and the pyramid, each one etched into stone and skin, not to inspire, but to command. Not to unify, but to fracture under the illusion of unity. It is here that our descent continues, into a deeper chamber of the buried world, a place where symbols become weapons and memory becomes the battlefield. It begins with an idea that the world we know, its nations, its wars, its revolutions, may not have been shaped by the desires of people, but by the rituals of a hidden priesthood of power. And they did not believe in gods the way common folk did. They believed they could become them, long before the term New World Order passed into popular conspiracy. It was a quiet oath, sworn by men who met beneath Rome, under the cloisters of dissolved temples, where remnants of Babylonian and Egyptian rites had not vanished but evolved. These men strategists, scribes, and bloodline keepers were not looking to rule by force. Force is temporary. Force is messy. Instead, they asked, what if control could be permanent? What if generations could be led like flocks, not by chains, but by the invisible architecture of belief? Their answer was the crafting of narratives so immense, so deeply rooted in language, law, and symbol, that to question them would be like questioning the air. Consider how monarchs ruled, not because they were the strongest, but because God supposedly chose them. Consider how heretics were burned not for crimes, but for ideas. Consider how money, once a mere tool, became a religion of its own. Its priests the bankers, its temples the banks, its miracles compound interest and national debt. The council understood that to truly dominate the future, you must first erase the past. And so they rewrote it. Ancient scrolls were lost in fires. Heretical gospels were buried beneath desert sands. Indigenous myths were translated into nonsense, and ancient technologies, those that hinted at free energy, or psychic awareness, or interstellar contact, were hidden in vaults beneath cities that still stand today. The agenda was simple: reduce man to consumer, reduce the sacred to superstition, reduce rebellion to madness. But it wasn't enough to hide knowledge, they had to replace it. And so came the education systems, born from Prussian military models, designed not to ignite thought, but to produce obedience. The bell, the uniform, the test, each a replica of factory life, preparing the child not for freedom, but for servitude. It was in this vacuum that the true psychological control began. Religion had once held the reins of the masses, but in the modern age, something new was needed. Something that looked like progress but acted like a leash. That something was media. In the early 20th century, men like Edward Bernays, nephew of Sigmund Freud, began to translate the findings of psychoanalysis not to heal, but to manipulate. Bernays realized that people could be made to want things they didn't need, to fear things that posed no threat, and to obey instructions disguised as desires. Through advertising, propaganda, and public relations, he laid the foundation for an empire of illusion, where perception mattered more than truth, and repetition created reality. The Council of the Nine, or whatever remained of it, now operated through proxies, corporations, think tanks, intelligence agencies. Their rituals were now digital, their symbols updated for the screen. The modern world, with all its innovations, became the perfect arena for invisible governance. And the smartphone became the new altar. Through it, the average citizen now lives in a bubble of curated information, controlled outrage, synthetic purpose. Algorithms track every doubt, every fear, every half-forgotten search, and feedback. A world tailored not to empower, but to pacify. Yet, even in this artificial dreamscape, echoes of older truths surface. Whistleblowers vanish. Researchers die under mysterious circumstances. Ancient sites are quietly fenced off by private military contractors. And deep in the Vatican's secret archives, miles of underground vaults guarded more closely than gold lie. Texts that tell a different story of Earth's past. A past in which humanity was not born ignorant, but fell into ignorance. The Sumerians spoke of sky beings who taught them astronomy, agriculture, even kingship. The Egyptians hinted that their pyramids were not tombs, but tools, resonance chambers, power stations. The Dogon tribe of Mali knew of stars invisible to the naked eye long before telescopes. These were not myths. These were memories. The council knew this. They studied it. And they feared it. Because within these ancient fragments was a threat. Greater than any army. The truth that man was not meant to kneel. That consciousness is not a defect, but a doorway. That symbols can be reversed. That fear can be unlearned. And that their empire rooted in secrecy could collapse in the light of awareness. And so they intensified their work. Every revolution was co-opted. Every movement that began in truth was infiltrated. Activism became theater. Political parties became brands. The illusion of choice replaced the burden of real decision. And dissent was corralled into echo chambers, where it could scream into the void without ever reaching the center. But still, beneath it all, something stirred. A strange synchronicity. A wave of remembrance. People began to question not just their leaders, but the frameworks that produced them. They began to study ancient knowledge, sacred geometry, neuroplasticity, collective trauma. They began to see the patterns, how the same symbols appeared in temples and tech logos, how the same numbers repeated in financial crashes and ritual dates. And as more began to connect the dots, the council, whatever it is now, grew desperate. False flags multiplied. Distractions escalated. Fear became the currency of the news cycle. And the greatest psyop of all was whispered through academia. That there is no meaning, that consciousness is a fluke, that you are alone. But it isn't true, and they know it. Because if there is meaning, if you are not alone, then you are powerful. And if you are powerful, their entire machine trembles. That's why they bury the truth in fiction, in fantasy, in horror films and comic books. That's why they laugh at conspiracy, why they punish curiosity, why they wrap truth in ridicule. Because somewhere, buried under all the lies, is a door they cannot close. A door in your mind. But to reach it, you must first look past the noise, past the news. Past the games of left versus right, science versus faith, progress versus tradition. You must see the machine, not just how it works, but what it hides. You must ask why the same families rule for centuries. Why history repeats in the same cycles. Why so many ancient sites align with stars. And why, despite all we've built, we feel more disconnected than ever. Because the control isn't just political, it's spiritual. The war is not just for land or money or labor, it is for the soul. And to win it, you must remember who you are, not a consumer, not a subject, not a user, but a being of immense potential. Trapped not by force, but by a story. A story written not in ink, but in fear. And once you see the story for what it is, you can write a new one.